Something unusual may have been moving through you today, and if you reacted more strongly than the situation seemed to deserve, pay attention before you judge yourself for it. Perhaps you spoke sharply to someone over something insignificant. Or maybe the words never left your mouth, but you felt that sudden urge to push back, withdraw, or release a frustration you could not fully explain. Somewhere during the middle of the day, between 11 and 2, the emotional atmosphere changed. The obvious explanation may have been traffic, an irritating email, an awkward conversation, or some tiny inconvenience that gave your mind a convenient target. But the intensity underneath it was not really proportional to what happened. It seemed to rise from a deeper place, arrive without warning, and then disappear almost as quickly, leaving you wondering why something so small had managed to affect you so much. And perhaps your experience was not anger at all. Maybe it was a strange heaviness, a sudden sadness that entered an otherwise ordinary moment without asking permission. You could have been folding clothes, listening to someone speak during a meeting, looking aimlessly at your phone, or simply moving through a familiar routine when an emotional weight suddenly appeared, even though there was no obvious reason for it to be there. If you experienced either reaction today, do not immediately turn it into a story about something being wrong with you. There is a specific astrological pattern behind the atmosphere, and it involves three forces interacting at once in a way that is unusual enough to make an ordinary day feel strangely disproportionate. There is a beginning to this pressure. There is a recognizable mechanism behind it, and there is also a point when the intensity begins to loosen. You may have noticed yourself lingering over a message tonight, staring at the same few words and reading them repeatedly, because you could not decide whether you were becoming overly sensitive or finally noticing something you had previously ignored. You may even have experienced one of those quiet moments that nobody else sees, perhaps standing alone in the kitchen late at night without actually needing anything, not hungry, not occupied, simply unable to settle into either movement or stillness. These moments often disappear into the background of a day because they are difficult to explain afterward. We call the whole thing strange, move on, and rarely stop to ask what was happening underneath. But today deserves a little more attention because the feeling does not have to be permanent simply because it felt intense while you were inside it. On August 18th, 2026, the moon moved into Scorpio sometime during the morning, and that quiet shift is an important part of the emotional texture you have been experiencing. Scorpio is not neutral ground for the energy involved here. Scorpio is traditionally associated with Mars, and when the moon enters this sign, emotional experience can become more closely connected with the qualities Mars represents. Imagine walking into a small enclosed room and suddenly noticing how much louder every sound feels. The sound itself may not have changed very much, but the environment makes its impact impossible to ignore. That is similar to what happens when the moon moves through Scorpio while Mars is already under pressure. Mars has been dealing with a square from Neptune, the planet associated with uncertainty, dissolution, and weakened boundaries. That square has been active since the 14th and continues through the 20th, creating several days of subtle tension that can be difficult to identify because it does not always announce itself through an obvious event. Instead, motivation can seem to disappear without a clear explanation. A plan that seemed straightforward can suddenly feel uncertain. A decision that normally would require very little thought can become strangely difficult. Something inside you may know what it wants, while another part of you cannot find a clear path toward it. Then the moon enters Scorpio and forms a square to Mars, while Neptune is still contributing its fog to the situation. That creates an emotional pressure point where feeling, action, and uncertainty become tangled together instead of operating separately. This is why the reaction can seem larger than the event that triggered it. The traffic may have been ordinary, the email may have been harmless, and the conversation may have contained nothing extraordinary. Yet your internal response could still feel unusually charged because the real tension was already present before the external event gave it somewhere to land. There is also a symbolic reason. Scorpio and Mars have such a complicated relationship with intensity. In Roman mythology, Mars represents war, direct action, aggression, and the instinct to move toward what he wants without unnecessary hesitation. Scorpio expresses intensity differently. Its energy is more hidden, more internal, more connected with what remains beneath the visible surface. It can represent emotional pressure that is not immediately spoken, resentment that has never been openly expressed, or inner conflict that continues quietly even when everything looks calm from the outside. When Martian force operates through Scorpio, the desire to act can become deeply psychological. The energy is still powerful, but it may not have an obvious place to go. Instead of simply doing something, you may feel yourself thinking about it, replaying it, analyzing it, feeling it, and carrying it internally until even a small moment becomes enough to release some of the pressure. Now place the Moon into that environment, while Neptune is simultaneously making Mars less certain and less direct, and the emotional experience becomes even harder to categorize. You can feel something strongly without knowing exactly what the feeling is. You can want to respond without knowing whether responding would actually help. You can sense that something matters without being able to explain why it matters. That is the signature of the day. Emotion meets action. Action meets confusion, and all three are intensified within the same 24-hour period instead of arriving separately. That is why today may have felt strangely personal, even when nothing objectively dramatic happened. The deeper lesson is not that astrology removes responsibility for your behavior. If you were unkind, your actions still belong to you. Understanding the astrological atmosphere does not excuse hurting another person. What it can provide is perspective. Instead of immediately deciding that you are failing, losing control, becoming too emotional, or somehow handling life worse than everyone around you, you can recognize that your internal system may simply be responding to an unusually concentrated combination of emotional and energetic pressure. There is relief in being able to name a pattern. The feeling remains real, but it no longer has to become a judgment about who you are. And because this configuration is temporary, the intensity you experience today does not automatically define tomorrow. What you felt was real, but it was also passing through a particular astrological environment, and recognizing that distinction is the first step toward understanding the very specific emotional fingerprint this combination can create. Watch what happens when something tiny suddenly feels much bigger than it should, because that disproportion is one of the clearest clues to the energy surrounding you today. A driver moving too slowly can feel almost deliberately provocative. A short message can sound colder than the words actually are. A brief response from someone can land with a force that makes you wonder why you were reacting so strongly to something you would normally dismiss within seconds. Yet the pattern can move in the opposite direction just as easily. Instead of irritation, you may suddenly feel a deep sense of longing, grief, or sadness with no obvious story attached to it. There may be no memory, argument, disappointment, or external event you can point toward and say, "This is why I feel this way." The emotion simply arrives, settles into you, and seems to ask to be acknowledged without offering an explanation first. For some people, these two experiences can appear within the same afternoon. You might feel ready to argue in one moment and unexpectedly emotional in the next, and that rapid contrast is actually one of the strongest indications of the planetary collision taking place. This is not necessarily one simple emotion passing through you in a predictable sequence. It is several different forces pressing against one another, which can make your internal experience feel inconsistent, confusing, and strangely difficult to control. Your body may notice the pressure before your conscious mind has any idea how to describe it. You might feel physically restless, as though there is energy moving through you that needs somewhere to go, yet no obvious action seems appropriate. Your jaw may become tight, your chest may feel tense. You may catch yourself holding your breath or carrying a physical sense that you are keeping something inside, even though you cannot yet identify exactly what that something is. Some people may even notice an almost electric sensation in their hands, as if their body is preparing to act while the mind cannot determine what action would actually solve anything. These sensations do not automatically mean that something is wrong with you. They can reflect the nervous system responding to a complicated combination of planetary pressures before the conscious mind has finished creating an explanation for what is happening. In moments like this, the body can sometimes reveal the truth of an experience before the intellect has organized it into a neat story. That does not mean every physical sensation should be interpreted through astrology, but within the context of today's particular configuration, the instinctive reaction can feel especially noticeable. At the same time, there is no single way this energy has to appear for everyone. Your own birth chart changes the way you may experience the same planetary atmosphere, And that is why one person can feel emotionally overwhelmed while another feels impatient, restless, or mentally scattered. If your chart contains strong water sign emphasis, particularly Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, the emotional side of this collision may become much more prominent. Feelings can rise with unusual depth, arrive more suddenly, and require more time than normal before they begin to settle. You may find yourself affected by something you cannot immediately explain or discover that an emotion continues to remain present long after the original moment has passed. If your chart carries strong fire sign energy through Aries, Leo, or Sagittarius, the same pressure may express itself more physically and actively. Instead of sinking inward, it can feel like internal heat, impatience, agitation, or combustible frustration surging for an outlet. You may want to move, speak, change something, confront something, or simply do anything that gives the excess energy somewhere to go. Those with stronger air or earth emphasis may experience the day differently again. Rather than feeling one overwhelming emotion, you may notice a persistent sense of mental static. Concentration becomes harder. Small interruptions feel unusually distracting. You may keep losing your train of thought without ever reaching the point of having one dramatic, emotional reaction. So if your experience today does not resemble the opening description exactly, do not assume that means the astrology has somehow passed you by. The same planetary tension can travel through different parts of a birth chart, which means its expression can vary considerably from one person to another. The deeper issue today is not simply what you are feeling, but what you decide that feeling means. This is where the combination becomes especially important. Scorpio pulls toward emotional depth and uncompromising honesty. Mars pushes toward movement, reaction, and immediate expression. Neptune introduces uncertainty, making it harder to know whether the conclusion forming inside your mind is actually accurate. When these influences overlap, a reaction can feel completely reasonable while you are experiencing it, only to look very different once the emotional pressure has passed and the moon has moved beyond Scorpio. That difference is important. Intensity is not the same thing as clarity. The fact that something feels urgent does not automatically mean it requires immediate action. In fact, if you suddenly feel compelled to send a message, confront someone, make an important call, or force a conversation while your emotions are at their strongest, consider that urgency itself as a reason to pause. Do not deny what you feel, and do not convince yourself that the emotion is meaningless simply because you are choosing not to act on it immediately. Instead, give the feeling room to exist without allowing it to make the decision for you. Scorpio does not respond well to pretending that an emotion never happened. When something is pushed down rather than acknowledged, it can return later with even greater pressure, sometimes carrying additional frustration because the original feeling was never given a chance to be understood. The healthier distinction is simple but powerful. Your emotion can be completely real without your immediate reaction being the right response. You can admit that you are angry without sending the message. You can acknowledge that you are hurt without starting the confrontation. You can recognize that you miss someone without deciding what that feeling demands from you tonight. Allow the emotional truth to remain intact, but give the decision more time. By morning, once the moon has moved on, you may understand the situation with a level of perspective that was unavailable while the pressure was at its peak. There is another piece of this that deserves compassion, especially if another person seemed unusually difficult today. If someone you normally trust suddenly became short-tempered, distant, unusually cold, or simply unlike themselves, they may have been navigating the same planetary collision, except their internal pressure moved outward instead of inward. That does not make hurtful behavior acceptable. Astrology can describe an atmosphere, but it does not remove personal responsibility. Someone remains responsible for the way they speak to you, even on a difficult astrological day. Both truths can exist together. You can recognize that their behavior was not acceptable while also understanding that the unusual tension of today may have made ordinary friction harder for almost everyone to handle gracefully. If a small disagreement happened with someone you generally trust, it may be wise to leave a little more room for context than you would during a completely ordinary week. But do not use today's astrology to erase something that has been happening repeatedly. There is a major difference between a single moment of unusual tension and a continuing pattern of disrespect, manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional harm A temporary atmosphere may explain why a minor interaction became intense, but it should never be used to dismiss a pattern that has been asking for your attention for much longer. That distinction is where today's lesson becomes more useful than simply knowing which planets are involved. You are being asked to recognize the difference between an emotion that needs to be felt and an action that needs to be taken. Those are not always the same thing, and learning to separate them may be the most important awareness to carry forward from this particular collision. Before you decide that someone deserves a permanent place in your judgment because of how they behaved during a few unusually intense hours today, take a breath and remember that temporary emotional weather can distort the way people respond to one another. This does not mean ignoring behavior that genuinely hurts you, and it certainly does not mean pretending that disrespect is acceptable. It means recognizing that today has created a compressed emotional atmosphere in which ordinary frustrations can become louder than they normally would, and the person standing in front of you may be carrying an internal struggle that you cannot see. Most people move through their days with entire emotional landscapes, hidden behind ordinary expressions, ordinary conversations, ordinary routines. You cannot see what another person is wrestling with any more easily than they can see what has been moving through you today. That is why this particular day calls for discernment instead of immediate conclusions. There is a simple test you can use whenever you feel pulled toward an action that suddenly seems absolutely necessary. Before you send the message, make the call, confront someone, or make a decision that could change the direction of a relationship. Stop for roughly 10 seconds and ask yourself one direct question. If I choose to do this within the next hour, will this certainty still feel just as solid tomorrow afternoon? Notice that this is not the same as asking whether you will regret your decision. Regret is complicated and can take time to reveal itself. The more useful question right now is whether your confidence is rooted in something stable or whether it is being temporarily strengthened by the emotional atmosphere surrounding you today. Sometimes certainty is genuine. Sometimes certainty is simply intensity wearing the costume of truth. That distinction matters enormously under a Scorpio moon, while Mars is still caught in its square with Neptune. If the emotional pressure feels physical tonight, give the body somewhere to place it. Movement may be far more helpful than forcing yourself to sit completely still while your mind attempts to solve an emotion that was never created through logic in the first place. Take a demanding walk. Exercise with intention. Pace around the room while you organize your thoughts to something simple that allows the body to discharge some of the energy it is carrying. Mars is fundamentally associated with movement and action, so when its energy is highly activated, completely suppressing the impulse to move can sometimes make the internal pressure feel even tighter. You do not need an elaborate workout or some dramatic physical challenge. Even 20 minutes outdoors at a pace just beyond your usual comfortable rhythm can change the way the pressure feels inside you. It gives the nervous system another channel through which to process what has accumulated. This can be more useful tonight than spending an entire hour sitting in one place trying to reason yourself out of a sensation that may simply need time, movement, and space. And if you cannot go outside or exercise wherever you are watching this, there is an even simpler practice you can begin immediately. Put both feet firmly on the floor beneath you. Let your body recognize the support underneath it. Then breathe in for 4 counts. Hold the breath for 4 counts, and release it for 6 counts. Make the exhale longer than the inhale. Repeat that sequence 5 times. This will not magically remove everything the day has brought to the surface, but it can interrupt the physical escalation that often happens when Mars and Neptune are creating an atmosphere of urgency and uncertainty. One sensation builds on another. A small thought becomes a serious concern. A concern becomes a perceived emergency. Then the body reacts to the emergency, even though nothing around you has actually reached that level of danger. Today, many situations may feel urgent simply because Scorpio intensifies whatever it touches, while Mars adds the desire to respond, and Neptune makes it harder to determine exactly what deserves a response. Not every intense feeling requires an immediate solution. Not every uncomfortable moment is an emergency. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow the nervous system to come down before asking the mind to decide what anything means. The emotional side of today's energy also benefits from privacy. If you are carrying sadness, resentment, longing, suspicion, disappointment, or another feeling that you cannot yet explain clearly, you may gain more from processing it privately tonight than from placing it immediately into another person's hands. Scorpio needs honesty, but honesty does not always require an audience. Writing can give the emotions somewhere concrete to exist without forcing another person to absorb an intensity you may not yet understand well enough to communicate fairly. Try writing 3 completely honest sentences without correcting them, softening them, or making them sound reasonable. Begin each thought from the simple starting point. What I actually feel right now is. Do not write what you think you are supposed to feel. Do not write what would make the situation easier to explain. Do not write what seems logical based on what happened. Write what is genuinely present inside you. This kind of direct private honesty can be especially useful during a Scorpio moon, because the emotional experience may arrive faster than language can organize it. When you slow down enough to put those feelings into words, the nervous system often receives a different message. You are no longer fighting the emotion, and you are no longer allowing the emotion to dictate your next action. You are simply witnessing it. If 3 sentences are not enough, let the writing continue with a few deeper questions. Ask yourself, what am I afraid this means about me? Ask, what would I say if I were not concerned about whether anyone else approved of the way it sounded? Ask, what have I been avoiding looking at directly that today's intensity has made more difficult to ignore? These questions are not designed to produce perfect answers tonight. Their purpose is to create a private container for the depth that Scorpio is demanding, so that the pressure does not have to escape through an argument, a sudden accusation, or a conversation you are not emotionally prepared to handle with clarity. And there is an important distinction here. If you discover through this process that something genuinely needs to be discussed, do not convince yourself that you have to solve the entire issue before the night is over. A real grievance, a real hurt, or a recurring problem can remain real even when today's emotional atmosphere is making it feel sharper. You can acknowledge that truth without forcing yourself to deliver the entire message while the sky is still amplifying your reactions. If necessary, simply tell the person that there is something you need to discuss and ask whether you can find time tomorrow. That small statement accomplishes something important. It acknowledges that the issue exists while giving the actual conversation enough distance to occur outside the strongest part of today's emotional pressure. That is not avoidance. Avoidance would mean denying that anything is wrong, pretending the feeling never appeared, or burying the issue until it disappears from conscious awareness. What you are doing instead is creating space between recognition and reaction, and that space may be exactly where clarity begins. There is a difference between knowing that something needs to be addressed and deciding that it must be addressed right now, and that difference becomes especially important under a Scorpio moon. Timing is not avoidance, and waiting is not weakness. In fact, once you understand what is happening beneath the surface, Scorpio can respect patience more deeply than almost any other sign, because genuine depth requires the right conditions to be revealed safely and honestly. You can know that a conversation matters without forcing yourself to have it. During the exact hour when your emotions are most activated, some of the most meaningful conversations in life become meaningful precisely because someone chose not to begin them while anger, fear, confusion, or emotional pressure was still controlling the atmosphere. Giving yourself more time does not make the truth less true. It simply gives you a better chance of expressing that truth without allowing temporary intensity to distort it. And if there are children in your home, or anyone who depends on you and tends to be especially sensitive to the emotional atmosphere around them, today calls for an extra layer of gentleness. Children often notice tension before they have the vocabulary to explain what they are sensing. They may not know that an adult is frustrated, emotionally exhausted, uncertain, or carrying something privately, but they can still register the change through tone, body language, silence, or the general feeling in the room. It can sometimes appear through behavior that seems unrelated. A child may become unusually attached, become more easily upset, react strongly to something minor, or experience their own small emotional eruption without being able to explain why. If you notice that happening today, it may be useful to remember that they are not necessarily creating an entirely separate problem. They may simply be responding in their own language to the same atmosphere you have been trying to navigate, without the adult context needed to understand what they are sensing. Sometimes the most supportive response is not a long explanation, but a calmer presence, a softer tone, and a little more patience than usual. The same principle applies to you tonight. Rest deserves more attention than you may normally give it, because the exhaustion associated with today is not necessarily connected to how much you physically accomplished. You can have a completely ordinary schedule and still arrive at the end of the day feeling as though you have been carrying something heavy for hours. That is because the pressure is not only happening through visible events. There are multiple planetary influences competing for expression at the same time, and the lack of cooperation between them can make the internal experience surprisingly draining. If you feel unusually tired despite having done nothing extraordinary, you do not automatically need to search for another explanation for that fatigue. It fits with the emotional and energetic atmosphere already described. Your system may simply need less stimulation and more recovery. That makes tonight a poor time to force yourself through unnecessary demands simply because you believe you should be productive. If something important can wait until tomorrow without creating a genuine consequence, allow it to wait. You are not failing by postponing what does not actually need to happen tonight. In fact, choosing not to overload yourself may be one of the more intelligent responses available under this particular sky. Sleep also deserves special consideration because Scorpio moons are traditionally associated with deeper, more vivid, and sometimes unsettling dream experiences, and Neptune's involvement can make the unconscious layer even more noticeable. If you wake during the night with a dream that feels unusually intense, strange, emotional, or difficult to shake, do not immediately dismiss it simply because it does not make literal sense. The deeper emotional processing associated with Scorpio does not necessarily stop when conscious awareness shuts down. Sometimes the material that could not be fully understood during the waking hours finds another route through dreams. Your conscious mind may have spent the entire day managing conversations, responsibilities, decisions, and distractions, leaving little room to process everything you were actually feeling. Sleep can create a different environment, where those emotions emerge through images, symbols, sensations, and stories that do not need to follow ordinary logic. If you tend to remember dreams, keeping something nearby to record a few details when you wake may be useful. You do not need to interpret everything immediately. Simply notice what remains emotionally present after you open your eyes. Sometimes the most important detail is not the exact storyline, but the feeling that stays with you after the dream has ended. That can give you another way to recognize what your waking mind may have struggled to name. Now it is important to understand why Neptune makes today's experience more difficult to navigate than a Scorpio moon forming a square with Mars would be by itself. Scorpio already brings intensity, Mars already brings activation. Together, they can create a strong emotional current, but that current can still have identifiable boundaries. You may know that you are angry. You may know that you are hurt. You may know that you need to act or release something. Neptune changes the experience by softening those boundaries until the feeling becomes harder to define. Instead of a clean emotional statement, you can end up inside a fog. You know that something is happening, but you cannot easily determine where it began, what exactly it is attached to, or whether the conclusion forming in your mind is fully reliable. That is why today's emotional experience can feel confusing as well as intense. It is not simply that you feel something strongly, you may also be questioning what the feeling is actually about. You may wonder whether you are reacting to the present moment, something that happened earlier, something unresolved from the past, or a combination of several things that have become tangled together. This uncertainty does not mean that you lack self-awareness. It is consistent with Neptune's influence. When clarity is naturally harder to reach, demanding perfect clarity from yourself only creates another layer of unnecessary pressure. You are allowed to say, "I know I feel something, but I do not understand it completely yet." That is not weakness. That is honesty. And if you have already been paying attention to the energy of this week, today's experience fits into a larger pattern. On Monday, Mercury formed a trine with Saturn, an alignment associated here with clearer thinking and more decisive judgment. Venus also met Jupiter on Monday, bringing a more comfortable and expansive tone through themes of ease and abundance. Those gentler influences may have received more attention because they are naturally easier to describe and more pleasant to experience. But beneath them, beginning on Sunday, Mars and Neptune had already been creating their own quieter and more difficult dynamic. That underlying tension did not disappear simply because other aspects were easier or more uplifting. It continued operating underneath the surface, gradually becoming more noticeable until today's moon in Scorpio gave it an emotional amplifier. What had previously been background pressure suddenly moved into the foreground. This happens often in astrology. The most visible or pleasant alignment is not always the only one shaping the day. Sometimes a quieter aspect is building beneath everything else, almost unnoticed, until another planetary movement activates the material that has been waiting there. Today was the point when that background tension became difficult to ignore. So, if you are reaching the end of this explanation and still feel as though the entire day has not completely made sense, that is perfectly acceptable. You do not need to solve every emotional question before you go to sleep. You do not need to identify every source of sadness, explain every irritation, or decide what every interaction meant. What matters tonight is simpler. Recognize that the experience is temporary. Recognize that there is a specific astrological mechanism behind the unusual combination of emotion, activation, and uncertainty. Recognize that not every feeling requires immediate interpretation, and not every intense reaction deserves to become a permanent conclusion. Tomorrow will not require you to carry this exact atmosphere forever, because the planets continue moving whether or not we have finished understanding what they brought to the surface. The sky does not remain frozen around one difficult moment, and neither do you. This is the point to remember above everything else. Whatever felt unusually heavy today does not have to become the emotional definition of tomorrow. This ends. Tomorrow morning brings the first unmistakable sign that today's emotional pressure is beginning to release, because the moon moves into Sagittarius early tomorrow morning, taking it out of the Scorpio environment that has been intensifying everything you have felt. What happened today was not the beginning of a new emotional reality, and it does not mean you have suddenly become more reactive, more unstable, or more emotionally difficult than you were last week. What you experience belongs to a very specific and temporary intersection, Scorpio amplifying Mars, Mars continuing to operate through the uncertainty created by Neptune, and the Moon adding its own emotional force directly into the center of that combination. These three influences do not repeatedly meet in exactly this arrangement, which is important to remember if today felt disproportionately heavy. You are not looking at a permanent new baseline. You are moving through a dated astrological window that becomes sharp today, begins easing tomorrow, and is mostly cleared by the weekend. Mars and Neptune remain loosely connected through the 20th, so there can still be a background layer of uncertainty or emotional haze for another day or two after tonight. But that does not mean you should expect tomorrow morning to feel exactly like today. Do not demand that you wake up and suddenly feel completely free of every trace of tension. The shift is more subtle than that, but it should still be noticeable. Within the first hour or two of tomorrow, you may begin to recognize that ordinary annoyances no longer carry quite the same emotional weight. Something that would have irritated you intensely today may simply register as an inconvenience. A heaviness that appeared without an obvious cause may begin to loosen. The constant sense that something needs to be figured out immediately may become less convincing. By Thursday, most people are likely to notice that this particular fog has thinned substantially, even though Mars technically remains in its square with Neptune through Thursday itself. The reason the relief can arrive before the aspect has completely separated is that the Moon's role today has been especially important. Mars and Neptune created the underlying tension, but the Scorpio Moon intensified and personalized that tension, bringing it directly into your emotional experience. Once the Moon leaves Scorpio, the same Mars-Neptune dynamic can continue in the background without producing exactly the same sharp emotional impact you felt today. This distinction matters because you may have been dealing with traces of this tension over the weekend without even realizing what you were experiencing. Today simply turned the volume up, tomorrow begins turning it back down. There is also a practical way to understand what today's experience was trying to show you, and it involves resisting the temptation to decide tonight whether every realization you had was either completely true or completely meaningless. Give it until tomorrow. A genuine insight usually survives sleep. When you wake up, the emotional charge may have softened, but the central observation still feels coherent when you examine it in ordinary daylight. You may still believe that a particular relationship needs attention, that a certain boundary matters, that something in your behavior needs change, or that an issue you have avoided deserves to be acknowledged. The emotion may no longer be overwhelming, but the truth underneath it remains recognizable. A reaction created primarily by today's fog often behaves differently. By morning, what felt enormous may suddenly seem much smaller. You may reread something you wrote tonight and wonder why it seems so urgent. You may struggle to reconstruct the exact reason a particular thought felt so convincing. It can resemble the experience of remembering a vivid dream after waking, knowing that it carried enormous emotional significance while you were inside it, but finding the intensity difficult to explain once daylight returns. Neither outcome is a reason to criticize yourself. The important point is that waiting gives you the opportunity to distinguish between emotional information and emotional distortion. That is why everything discussed earlier about postponing action matters so much. Waiting does not mean dismissing what happened. It does not mean telling yourself that today's feelings were imaginary, irrational, or unimportant. It means placing the feeling in the correct sequence. First, experience it. Then, allow the emotional pressure to decrease. Then, return to what surfaced and determine what still deserves your attention. This is a very different instruction from simply saying, ignore it, and eventually it will disappear. Ignoring something can allow an unresolved issue to remain hidden. What you are being encouraged to do instead is give the issue enough space to become clearer before deciding what to do about it. If something meaningful came up today, make a concrete plan to revisit it. You could choose tomorrow evening, once the moon's amplification has moved away and the Mars-Neptune fog has become thinner, and reread anything you wrote tonight. You could look again at the message you almost sent. You could reconsider the conversation you wanted to begin. You could return to the question that kept circling through your mind. If the issue still matters after the emotional intensity has settled, then you have something much more valuable than a temporary reaction. You have information that survived the atmosphere that first brought it forward. Today may have supplied the raw emotional material, but tomorrow or the following day is where you can decide whether that material contains something useful. There are also certain themes that tend to emerge when Scorpio, Mars, and Neptune interact in this particular way, and recognizing those themes can make the experience far less mysterious. Trust is one of the biggest. You may question whether another person is being completely honest with you, but you may also question your own judgment. You can find yourself asking whether you are correctly reading a situation or projecting something onto it, because you are already emotionally activated. Old resentment can also return unexpectedly. Something you believed you had completely resolved may suddenly come back into your awareness, not necessarily because the issue was never healed, but because Scorpio has a tendency to reach beneath the surface and locate whatever remains unfinished. Sometimes an old emotion returns because there is genuinely another layer that needs to be understood. Sometimes it returns simply because the current atmosphere has opened a door that is normally closed. That is why the presence of the feeling itself should not automatically be treated as proof that you need to take immediate action. Another major theme is control. You may begin wondering who is actually directing the situation. You may question whether you are making conscious choices or simply responding to circumstances as they arrive. You may realize that you have been trying to control an outcome that was never completely within your control, or recognize that you have quietly surrendered your own agency while waiting for another person or situation to determine what happens next. These questions can surface with unusual force during a day like this, even when the answers are not immediately clear. Scorpio brings the desire to understand what is hidden. Mars wants to regain movement and control, and Neptune makes certainty harder to hold on to. That combination can make the search for an answer feel urgent, even when the answer itself needs more time to emerge. None of these themes should automatically be considered negative. Trust, resentment, control, emotional honesty, and personal agency are simply areas that become easier to notice when Scorpio receives this much amplification. Once you can name the theme, the experience often becomes easier to manage. Instead of saying something is terribly wrong, and I do not know what it is, you may be able to say, I am questioning trust today, or I am noticing an old resentment, or I am feeling unusually concerned about whether I have control over this situation. Naming the experience creates distance between you and the feeling. You are still allowing yourself to feel it, but you are no longer completely submerged inside it. And this understanding can become useful long after this particular transit has passed. Mars forms squares with Neptune periodically throughout a year, while the Moon enters Scorpio every month and remains there for roughly 2.5 days. Most of the time, those cycles do not overlap closely enough to produce the same concentrated effect you experience today. This month, however, they did line up in a way that allowed the emotional intensity of the Scorpio Moon to interact directly with the existing Mars-Neptune tension. That is why today's experience can feel unusually specific. It is not simply that Mars squared Neptune, and it is not simply that the Moon entered Scorpio. It is the way those separate movements temporarily converged that created this particular atmosphere. Understanding the mechanism is much more useful than simply memorizing that today felt strange. The next time a similar alignment develops, you may recognize the pattern before it has a chance to convince you that something is fundamentally wrong with you or your life. You may notice the sudden irritation, the unexplained heaviness, the restless physical energy, the urge to act immediately, or the confusing certainty about something that you cannot quite explain. And instead of automatically believing every thought that arrives with that intensity, you may pause and recognize what is happening. Emotion, drive, and uncertainty are meeting again. The feeling is real, but the pressure is temporary. The message may deserve attention, but the reaction does not necessarily deserve immediate action. That recognition alone can change the way you move through the next difficult day. Today does not have to become a verdict about you, another person, or your future. It can simply become information, something you experienced, observed, and later understood with greater clarity. The sky moves forward and your emotional experience moves with it. By tomorrow, the intensity begins to loosen. By Thursday, the fog becomes considerably thinner. And by the weekend, this particular configuration is largely behind you. What remains is the past that is actually worth keeping. Whatever truth survived after the intensity faded, the pattern does not disappear forever after today. And that is actually good news because the Moon returns to Scorpio roughly every 27 days, giving you another opportunity to observe what this sign awakens inside you without necessarily carrying the same intensity that made today feel so unusual. The next time the Moon passes through Scorpio, you may notice a familiar emotional depth, a stronger instinct to look beneath the surface, or a greater awareness of what you usually keep private. But most future Scorpio moons should feel considerably softer than this one, because they will not necessarily be occurring while Mars is simultaneously caught in its current square with Neptune. That difference gives you something valuable to compare. Instead of treating every Scorpio moon as evidence that something dramatic is about to happen, you can begin noticing your own personal response to Scorpio when the surrounding circumstances are calmer. Perhaps you become quieter. Perhaps you think more deeply. Perhaps old memories become easier to access. Perhaps you feel more emotionally perceptive, or simply more aware of what you normally push aside. Whatever your individual response happens to be, paying attention to it repeatedly creates something like a private emotional reference library. Over time, you begin to recognize your own version of Scorpio energy. You learn what depth feels like inside your body, what intensity feels like in your thoughts, how your emotional instincts behave when you are more sensitive to what is happening beneath the surface, and how long it normally takes you to return to equilibrium. That self-knowledge becomes especially useful when an unusual combination appears, because you can compare today's amplified experience against your own normal baseline. You are no longer simply asking, "Why do I feel this way?" You can begin asking, "Is this actually my usual response to Scorpio, or is something else intensifying it today?" That is one of the quieter but more practical reasons for observing astrology in the first place. It does not have to be about predicting every event with absolute certainty. It can become a practice of repeated observation, where you watch the patterns of your own life closely enough that the language of astrology becomes a framework for understanding rather than a source of fear. The more consistently you observe yourself, the more useful the framework becomes. You begin collecting evidence from your own experience instead of relying entirely on someone else's interpretation of what a transit is supposed to feel like. Then when another unusually heavy day appears, you are less likely to assume that you have suddenly become the problem. You have a point of comparison. You have memories of previous emotional patterns. You have already learned that intensity can rise, peak, and pass. That recognition can create a surprising amount of calm, even while the experience itself is still uncomfortable. Before this day completely closes, there is also something worth asking yourself very honestly. What did today actually require from you? Maybe it required patience with another person, especially someone who happened to receive the sharper edge of your mood even though they did not truly deserve it. Maybe the challenge was internal instead. Perhaps you were asked to be patient with yourself because an emotion arrived faster than you could find the words to explain it. There are moments when the most difficult thing is not solving the feeling, but allowing yourself to experience it without immediately turning it into a judgment about who you are. And perhaps today's assignment was even simpler than that. Maybe it was endurance. Maybe the accomplishment was simply moving through a difficult emotional atmosphere without adding a decision, confrontation, message, or permanent conclusion that you were not actually ready to make. Sometimes getting through the day without making the situation worse is a genuine form of progress. If you are reading this now, then the most intense portion has already passed simply because you made it this far. You do not need to finish processing every emotion tonight. Tomorrow does not require a perfect explanation for everything that happened today. It asks for something much more manageable. Meet the next day with a little more rest, a little more perspective, and less of the fog that made today's reactions feel so immediate. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from understanding a difficult experience rather than merely surviving it. Survival can leave you thinking only about how quickly you want the difficult day to end. You move forward, but you may not understand what happened, which means the next similar experience can feel completely unfamiliar all over again. Understanding changes that pattern. When you can identify what contributed to the emotional pressure, you carry something useful into the future. The next time the moon enters Scorpio, the next time Mars forms a square with Neptune, or even the next time you experience an ordinary day that suddenly feels disproportionately difficult without an obvious explanation, you have a better chance of recognizing the shape of the experience before self-doubt takes over. Instead of immediately thinking, "What is wrong with me?" you may remember that there have been moments before when your emotional intensity felt enormous and then gradually returned to normal. You may recognize that a feeling can be important without being an emergency. You may remember that an impulse can be real without requiring immediate action. That is the deeper offer underneath everything we have explored today. It is not a promise that difficult days will never happen again. They will. As long as the planets continue moving through their cycles, different combinations will continue creating different forms of pressure, intensity, confusion, and emotional activation. The point is not to eliminate those experiences. The point is to become more familiar with your own responses so that the next difficult day does not automatically have the power to convince you that something is permanently wrong. The map becomes clearer each time you observe yourself honestly. Whatever today asked you to learn, you can carry that information forward without carrying the entire emotional weight of the day. And if you experienced something specific today, share it. Maybe you had an unexpected outburst. Maybe sadness appeared without a clear name. Maybe you felt restless for hours without knowing what you wanted to do with that energy. Those details matter because personal experience gives shape to what astrology describes in general terms. The comments can reveal how the same planetary atmosphere lands differently in different lives, and sometimes seeing another person describe an experience that resembles your own can be strangely reassuring. If this explanation helped you understand what was happening while it was happening rather than leaving you to spend the entire day wondering why you felt so unlike yourself, staying connected to this kind of content can help you recognize future shifts sooner. And if someone you know had a difficult day without understanding why, sharing this with them may give them the same sense of context. But before we leave today's energy behind, remember one final truth that reaches beyond this particular Scorpio moon. Difficult emotional days can feel intensely isolating while you are inside them. There is often a private sensation that something is wrong with you specifically, that everyone else is moving through an ordinary day while you alone are carrying an invisible weight that nobody else could possibly understand. Yet that perception can be misleading. Somewhere around you, other people may be experiencing the same unexplained heaviness, the same impatience, the same restless physical energy, or the same sudden sadness without having any language for what is happening inside them. You cannot see their internal weather any more than they can see yours. From the outside, someone may look completely normal while privately wondering why the day feels so difficult. Knowing that does not magically remove the discomfort, but it changes the story you tell yourself about it. You were never necessarily as isolated inside today's experience as it may have felt. What seemed like a completely private struggle can also be part of a larger, temporary atmosphere, moving through many people in different forms. And perhaps that is the most useful place to leave this. You do not have to carry today into tomorrow as proof that something is wrong with you. You can let the day become an experience you observed, felt, survived, and eventually understood. The moon moves forward, the atmosphere changes, and your perspective can change with it. Tomorrow is lighter,